Education is rightfully occupying centre stage as widespread unemployment destabilises many economies across the globe. That's in both developed and developing environments. In this meeting of the minds debate, we look at the future of education as it pertains to the African context. Joining me to take the discussion further in Johannesburg, we have Professor Mark E. Smith, Vice-Chancellor, Lancaster University, UK, Professor Seth Kunen, Vice Principal for Internationalisation at the University of Aberdeen. And joining us in our Lagos studio is Dr. Nasi Okonido, the Dean of Lagos Business School and Chairperson of the Association of African Business Schools. And in Rwanda, Kigali, we have Dr. Michel Bezi. He's Distinguished Service Professor, Engineering and Public Policy, Associate Director, Carnegie Mellon University, as I said, in Rwanda. Thank you all for joining me. Let's kick off with the West African scenario. And Dr. Okonido, let's start with the state of education as you currently see it in West Africa.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to say that my tenure as chairperson of the Association Business School ended a year ago now, so I'm just a board member now. Now, in terms of the current state of higher education in West Africa, I do believe that we still need to make a lot of progress. I think that we haven't yet caught on to a number of developments that have happened, not only in the global economy, but also as it relates to Africa as well as Africa. What I see is a disparity between the graduates that are being produced and the needs of industry. On the one hand, I believe that the courses on offer may not be what it is that is required, entirely required, to help the region move forward in terms of economic and, if you like, industrial developments. Also, in a large number of cases, I think they were challenged by the currency of the curricula on offer. In several instances, updating of curricula because of bureaucracy and other reasons take a long time to implement, with the consequence that I feel that the graduates that are being produced in the sub-region perhaps may not necessarily meet the needs that are required to propel the region to the next level of economic development.
I'm going to bring you in here, Professor Smith. Lancaster University, Ghana, in its third year of operation. And I just want to find out whether you echo Dr. Okonido's sentiments about the level of graduates being produced in the sub-region and whether their skills are appropriate for businesses in that territory.
Well, it was very interesting to hear the Dean in her views, because I think it's a refrain that you hear throughout the world. Businesses and the wider communities often say that the graduates that are being produced by the universities are not meeting all the skill needs for the businesses and environment they're going to go into. And I think it's because that their environment that they are entering is changing all the time, and sometimes curricula do move more slowly than the environment with which they're in. And I think the important thing is to have a dialogue with the people who are going to take the graduates on and ensure that there are mechanisms for them inputting into the curricular development. So I think that it's a valid criticism, although I think sometimes the criticism goes too far, in the sense that the broader skills that I think most university degrees have now taken very seriously, i.e. beyond the core academic elements of the discipline, are much developed, whether it be in the UK or in West Africa. And we're thinking all of the time about how we improve our curriculum to make it more relevant to where the graduates are going to end up.
Professor Kunen, if you can weigh in with the Aberdeen perspective.
I think that the issue that business has is a real issue, and universities do have to make sure to design appropriate programs of study that enable students to go out into industry, to go out into society, and to be able to work at a successful level and quickly. That being said, very often the criticism is treating a university degree in too instrumental a manner. It's treating it as if it's only about getting students to be ready for very specific types of employment. Whereas what a university degree really does is actually help a student develop not only for employment, but as a whole person, as a citizen of society. And that's as important as the instrumental aspects of what a university degree does. And in Aberdeen and in most British universities, we take that point very seriously. We recognize that education is partly about a certain type of skills that transfer directly to industry, but equally it's about transforming the whole student to enable them to be independent, creative, and challenging thinkers for society.
Dr. Beasy, let's move to you in Kigali, and perhaps you can weigh in on the state of education as you see it in Rwanda and the broader region of East Africa.
Yes, thank you. Well, what we see in the region here is, I guess, very similar to what my colleagues have said. It's a struggle for universities to deliver what industries are expecting. There are many reasons for that. I don't know if you want me to go into that, but some of the reasons is the lack of contact between industries and universities. And frankly said, I think this has to be a two-way effort. I see too many industries complaining about that, but not actually doing very much to help universities adapt their curriculum to their needs. There are easy ways of doing that by getting those industries to participate in the definition of your curriculum, by having contact with them in terms of, for example, what we do, having students working on solving industry problems submitted by the industries or doing internships in industries. The other problem that I personally see in the region is obviously the size of the problem in terms of the number of students for the numbers of universities. In Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, just to give you an idea, if you divide the number of inhabitants by the number of universities, we have one university per more than 1 million inhabitants. Just to give you a point of comparison, in the United States, it's 100,000 inhabitants per university. So that's an order of magnitude of difference. How do we address that? I guess we will discuss during this discussion here. But that's where potentially technology can come in and enable some transformation that may address this problem.
Dr. Okonido, if I can come back to you there, Dr. Beasy putting on the table that you need more contact between industry and universities. This certainly is one solution, and can you see tertiary institutions, higher education institutions in specifically Nigeria making better inroads, making better contact with industry to increase the relevance of the courses, as you pointed out in the beginning, that is an area of concern?
Indeed, it is an area of concern, and I must say that there's been some improvements over the last couple of years. Faced with the problem of unemployment, worse than that is that sometimes in a large number of instances vacancies do exist, but of course you find that the graduates who are being produced do not meet the needs of those as well. So faced with that challenge, I believe that a number of institutions are now starting to look at ways by which they can foster the collaboration. But then it comes in different ways. One is to have the contact with industry. So I see some progress being made in my view. I think that it is still not sufficient. But it goes beyond that to actually understanding the needs of the industry. Apart from the needs for skills which they have, it's looking at the particular type of skills that go beyond the academic skills. That a number of graduates who will have to function in this environment will have to have developed in them. Faced with the challenges of sometimes rapidly changing policies, as well as the strength of the institutions that exist in various countries in the sub-region there, you find that skills such as creativity, innovation, adaptation are very necessary. But then, if you look at the ways by which this is fostered, be it through the pedagogy or other learning experiences that the students go through, I think that there's still a great deal of work that needs to be done in that regard. We can also look at the research that's conducted. Several times, the research that's undertaken within the universities by the students, and I dare say by the professors, may be very academic and may not necessarily meet the needs of the industry. This is what close contact, understanding the challenges facing industry, would enable us to be more productive in terms of the research outputs, which can actually go to foster the development of the various industries. So I would like to see a lot more progress, and I'm seeing now. I think that it's very slow in several instances, and it could be a whole lot better.
Professor Kuhnen, you are agreeing there with Dr. Okonido, and let's focus on the research element. Crucial for developing economies to boost research, for those developing economies to enter the global knowledge economy.
There's two sides of the research question. One is the nature of the research itself and how it impacts on students, and second is the way that research can transform the society in which it is being undertaken. In the first, one of the key parts of the Aberdeen education, particularly in engineering, but in many other areas as well, are involving the students as undergraduates in the engagement with research, doing research themselves, becoming independent researchers and thinkers. But the key point is that the research that they're doing is highly practical. It's connected directly with questions that arise out of industry. It's connecting with real problems that need to be solved. So the students become independent thinkers. They gain the ability to do research, but they're actually asking questions that are real life questions that will help industry through the research that they're doing, but it also enable them to work much better when they're working in industry itself. On the other side, much of the research that has been done by Western universities, historically has been from the outside, coming in, doing the research, and going out, and leaving very little behind. And that's a model of research that is increasingly outdated. Within the research that Aberdeen University is doing, for example, in relation to maternal health and infant mortality, the research project had two aspects. One was getting really good evidence about the types of interventions that would enable the best outcomes for women, the best outcomes for children. But equally, it was to raise and build capacity within the various African countries in which the work was being done. So it produced excellent research, but it also created a research base within these different African countries that then can go on to do other research and to develop new and challenging questions that are relevant to the growth and development within Africa. So you need both of those sides, and that's a fundamental aspect of research today.
Dr. Bizi, I want to bring it back to Kigali. So it's well known that Rwanda is intent on establishing itself as a key knowledge economy within the African context. Perhaps you can just weigh in there with your thoughts on the role that research will play from institutions like Carnegie Mellon.
Yes, I mean, to develop a knowledge economy, that means basically that you are basing your strategy on human people, right? Because knowledge is managed by people. And that, I think, is the strategy of the government here, to develop the capacity for people so that they learn about ICT and can start an ICT industry in this region that will generate all those IT-based services that can then develop this knowledge-based economy. All the way from the level of the government delivering their services as e-services to internet-based services that you can sell even internationally through the network, which unlocks the country. So yes, that is an important contribution that we as Carnegie Mellon have been invited here to do in this region in collaboration with the local universities, because this starts very early. This process, in my opinion, starts very early in the education process. The government of Rwanda, for example, has done extensive investment in 1 laptop per child, starting in primary school, and that is really what is needed. I think the greatest strength of Africa is youth, 60% of the population being less than 25 years old. These are the people that will more easily than old people like us, learn about these technologies, and if you do that from the very early stage, there will be a natural progression all the way to the university, where, you know, in master's program like we deliver, you then bring them at a world-class level in terms of expertise they can develop, that they can then apply with their creativity in developing innovation that are appropriate and sustainable in this region.
Professor Smith, Lancaster, Ghana is all about sustainability. Again, bricks and mortar you have deployed on the ground in that territory. I suppose that shows your level of commitment to, again, and still staying with the research theme, to helping Africa enter the knowledge economy, global knowledge economy.
Yeah, absolutely, because the model on which many universities are built, and particularly the world-class universities, is that interrelationship between being taught by people who are developing new knowledge, such that the students that are coming out can have regular contact with people who understand how research is done, and it's not an easy process. And therefore, any university that wants to purport to have be a Lancaster degree needs to have a research element to it. And in fact, building research capacity on the ground in Accra is going to be a very important element of the university there. If I might, I want to go back to a couple of points that have been made earlier about the nature of the skills and how that's linked to research. Because I think this is very important, because absolutely, from what I said earlier, having the ability to, you know, be able to work in a broader environment, communication skills, team working, they should all be part of an undergraduate degree. But one of the key questions an industry needs to answer, but if you're taking a degree, for example, in English or in computer science or in physics, you can go on to a whole range of particular careers. And therefore it's very difficult, beyond those generic transferable skills, to know what you should be teaching. And often when industry is being critical, it's actually being critical of things that are very industry specific. And therefore I think partnership is particularly appropriate at postgraduate level. So I can give you two examples. In the UK, we at Lancaster, we have a degree which is being tailored for middle and senior managers within one of the major supermarkets within the UK to learn about the food supply chain, so that it makes that supermarket more friendly. Now that's a tailored MSc course for their managers. It's a big company, so a large number. But that is now bringing the skills directly, and a company has co-developed that with the university. The second point is this idea we've heard about innovation and bringing innovation and entrepreneurship. Again, that's something which you can have at broad level within the undergraduate curriculum, but it's probably more appropriate to postgraduate. And again, an example there of global entrepreneurship between Lancaster and the Chinese province of Guangdong province is a 2-year MSc where the student learns about innovation in the first year at Lancaster, but then goes and actually does their project within a Chinese company within Guangdong province. So that again is developed such that it shows how you're developing these skills as part of the course, but that's at master's level.
I want to bring us now to the funding issue. Obviously, this is an emotive issue. We've just seen in South Africa the Fees Must Fall campaign being executed among university students. And Dr. Okonido, let me bring you in here. Funding models in Lagos specifically, obviously we see huge differentiation between state-funded education, tertiary education, and private models that are being deployed. Can I get you to colour?
Yeah, if we take the case of Nigeria, the large proportion of the universities in the country are state-owned universities. And for state-owned universities, the tuition is free. Whereas for the private universities, and we only started to see the emergence of private universities in the country over the last 12 years or so, those are fee-paying institutions. Obviously, the funding that's available to the universities has a lot of implications for not only what they can do, but also the quality, because it impacts not only things like research, which we've been discussing, but also infrastructure, the salaries and the remuneration of the faculty, and so on and so forth. But if we look at the amount of funding there, I believe that in the case of Nigeria, it's still very much below what the UNESCO prescribed proportion should be. It's not so much the case perhaps in some other countries within the sub-region of West Africa, in which we find a few countries that have in excess of 30, 31. We've increased the bit and it's come to 8, but I must say that the funding that's available to education usually struggles with other what may be considered high priority areas. and also is a consequence of the total revenue available. In this year in particular, where we've had crisis in the oil sector and we've had reduced revenues there, it is to be expected that the funding that comes to the sector is going to be reduced. So we find that with the private universities, they're better able, because they're fee paying and they receive tuition from students, they're better able to put in place better infrastructure. We do believe that better able to fund research, depending on the proportion that's attributed to research as well there. So this is an area that has to be considered. But then we find that in the past there have been attempts to introduce tuition fees to some institutions, and I must say that they have been met with a lot of resistance from the larger populace who depend on the going to university on this free tuition that's available. Sort of like a chicken and egg syndrome, because without adequate funding, there's only so much that can go, which goes to improve the quality. On the other hand, there's this mass of youth that, if not properly educated, will turn out to be a menace in the future there. So these are the conflicts that the funding model, that come into play based on the funding model that's existent in Nigeria.
Professor Smith, it's not only developing economies that are struggling with the right funding model when it comes to tertiary education. I know that right now the funding model in the United Kingdom is under review. Perhaps you can elaborate.
Yeah, so it was very interesting to hear our colleague in Nigeria, and also I turned on the radio last night and heard what a big issue it is here in South Africa, and I can assure it's also a big issue in the UK. But there are some fundamental questions that have to be answered, really. One is that in most countries, there's been a political decision taken that they believe in the massification of higher education, that the upskilling, the up-educating of the population in general is a good thing, and I certainly do believe that. But then the question is, how do you pay for it? And I think that's the thing that everyone struggles with. How do you actually pay for it? And I think one thing that needs to be kind of underlined here is you always have this term free education. There's no such thing as free education. Somebody
has to pay for it in the end.
The question is whether it's the state up front or it's the individual up front. And then I think you have to make a decision as to how much you believe there is public good and how much do you believe there is private good in higher education. Now, I think the answer doesn't lie at either extreme there. It's somewhere in the middle. And in the UK, what we've done is we've come up, I say the UK, we'll hear it's different in Scotland in a moment, I'm sure, but in England, we've certainly believed that more should be paid by the individual, but the deal that's been done is that the individual doesn't have to find the cash up front, that it's all lent from the government, and then there are fairly generous terms of repayment in up to 30 years, and if after 30 years it's not repaid, the government then has it as a debt on the public purse. So,
but you still spend most of your life paying back that student loan.
You can do. It depends on what type of job and level of salary you go into. But I think the case is once you massify the higher education system, the strain that puts on, because if you take the money for higher education, there are other things you can't do: health, public infrastructure, etc., because you only have a finite pot. And therefore it's the balance, and every society, I think, has to make its mind up as to where it wants that balance to be. And it's an experiment going on in the UK at the moment, and it's very different from other countries, and within each country in the UK it's different. So we'll see in the end where we end up with the success of the different systems.
Professor Coonan, obviously tertiary education in Scotland is funded by the state, but there's a funding gap.
Yes, I mean, in Scotland, the Scottish government chose not to impose student fees when the UK government imposed them on English students. And that, to me, was a very important choice, but it has a number of fundamental issues attached to it that have already been alluded to. The first of those issues relates to the level at which government chooses to fund universities. Now, in the United Kingdom, it becomes a stark question because we can look at the funding that the English universities get out of the student fees, and we can look at the funding that Scottish universities get from the Scottish government. And there is a significant difference in the amount of money that English students give to their universities per year and to what we in Scottish universities get per student, which means that the kind of areas that we can compete with English universities is a tough issue and raises tough challenges and questions for Scottish universities. And I think that that's the fundamental question. It's one that's been alluded to, that if government chooses to say students should be able to go to university without having to bear the cost, then government has a responsibility, if it wants its universities to be globally competitive, if it wants its universities to have the best quality infrastructure, if it wants its students to receive the best quality teaching, then government then is taking upon itself the responsibility to say, we are going to prioritize funding universities. But as has been alluded to, very often other priorities come in, health and so on. And so year on year, government is having to balance these priorities. And very often, universities become in a rather precarious position because they're not sure what the level of funding will be. But the other side, I think, is equally important. And this is something that Professor Smith alluded to. I think that in the UK, to my mind, the balance between university as a public good and an individual good has shifted somewhat. So that in England, when fees were imposed, it was a view that was taken and expressed by various government ministers was that this is something that is good for the student. And there's no question that the student gains immeasurably by going to university, both in terms of their personal growth and development and in terms of their employability. And British universities have extraordinarily high employability. But it ignores the fact that going to university, having high quality research, high quality education, and high quality graduates is also a public good. It's something that gives back to the society. It gives it entrepreneurship, it gives it creativity, it gives it intellectual challenge, it gives it sort of the leaven that allows it to expand. And without recognizing that, we lose a lot. And so I think that the balance has to be there in recognizing that education, particularly higher education, is something that is good for the society, and the society has responsibilities to make sure that its students have access to the best quality education.
You're watching Meeting of the Minds. We're taking a short break, and when we return, we continue with our discussion on the future of education in the African context. Welcome back. Still in our Johannesburg studio, Professor Mark E. Smith, Vice-Chancellor, Lancaster University, UK. Professor Seth Coonan, Vice Principal for Internationalization at the University of Aberdeen. In Lagos, we have Dr. Enasi Okonido, Dean of Lagos Business School, and in our Kigali studio, Dr. Michelle Bizi, the Distinguished Service Professor, Engineering and Public Policy, Associate Director, Carnegie Mellon University in Rwanda. Dr. Bizi, we've been discussing funding models, and we've covered both the developed world and the developing environment when it comes to West Africa. Perhaps I can get your thoughts on appropriate funding models when it comes to East Africa.
Well, when you understand the gap that I mentioned earlier, that in sub-Saharan Africa you have one university per 1 million inhabitants, there's a huge gap that needs to be funded there. So the first idea you come up with is obviously the government themselves need to do significant investment, but we know very well that in these countries that is very limited. So the next option, which you see a lot right now, is the private universities who come here and develop universities in the region. The problem with those is that they obviously have a profit target, and as a consequence, the type of education that they provide may not always be very aligned with the priorities of the government. So for example, here in Rwanda, they want to develop a knowledge-based economy, so it is important to develop education in STEMs, and, technology, computer science, etc. Those cost a lot of money, so they are obviously not very keen from private university to invest a lot of money because what they look at first is profit. Then the third opportunity, I believe, for funding really has to come, as I said earlier, from the industry itself. Because at the end of the day, the industry has two options. Either they're going to have to take what is currently coming out of the universities, and they seem not to be happy with that, and therefore they will have to invest for each employee that they recruit a lot of money to bring them on where they want them to be. Or if they start thinking about funding universities I will think they would get a much bigger return on investment for their money by leveraging the capacity of the university. These are the three sources of funding that I see, the last one being the industry. And then last but not least, let's not forget that technology allows you to multiply the return on investment that you would do in education these days. As if you use technology in education, you can probably get much better results in terms of following the students individually and assessing their performance, and as a result, getting them better prepared when they come out.
In our studio audience today, we have the Dean of Henley Business School. I'd like you to weigh in, sir, with thoughts on where we should take the discussion for the next 20 minutes.
Thanks very much. I thought the comments were marvellous, actually, and very well balanced. The question I have is about the future of education in Africa. What is the university model that fits this context? We've got partially educated people. We've got very partial infrastructure. People are learning their second or third languages. We don't have the luxury to wait. Research takes a long time and doesn't deliver for a long time. And anyway, why should one have a highly intellectual approach to education when you've got a massive gap in the middle? So, at Henley we have a motto, which is we build a people who build the businesses that build Africa. And we focus a lot on experiential education, we focus a lot on action learning, many, many different modalities. And I would challenge the kind of, I hate to say it, but rather Western model of education that's portrayed here and say, is that really valid here? We have to learn quickly in beta mode, and we have to deliver, and we have to build people's, as you were saying, confidence, creativity, innovation, and have a sense of activism rather than a sense of rather distant ivory tower, modeling what a university is. And I would like to explore that.
Professor Smith.
I think that's an extremely valid viewpoint, and I think it's very crucial to realise that what I wasn't suggesting is that the exact model of a Western university should just be transplanted into any African, East African, any sub-Saharan African context, because I think what you've said is absolutely right, that the problems it's trying to solve are different. However, I think that the fundamental tenets of having elements of the wider skills that you get from a research-based environment should not be lost either. So it's because if you a struggle even in the US and the UK, the model of a research university anyway in those contexts is deeply expensive and needs to be rethought anyway, in my opinion. But nevertheless, and so therefore transplanting that problem is the wrong thing to do. But nevertheless, realising that there are key elements of the research skills. However, I think this idea about understanding the skills that the local context needs and making it much more interactive with that community are crucial. And the same pressure's coming on us in the UK. So, for example, universities, and I think have been rightly criticised for thinking about business university interactions often in the context of large global corporates, whereas most jobs are created within SMEs. And the ability of universities to interact with SMEs, create the right skills for SMEs, I think have been limited. So we're challenged with that. And I think in the African context, understanding about internships and elements of the education which are directly within the types of business, and I use that term very broadly, that will be tomorrow's driver of the economies, I think is absolutely crucial.
Professor Coonan?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up 2 points. One aspect is the element that in the United Kingdom we call research-led education. And that's often characterized as purely people that are ivory tower researchers giving students the experience only of research. But that's really only half the story. The other half of the story is that research-led education is teaching students to become independent thinkers themselves, even as undergraduates. And that's something that I think is essential in any context, that we need people to be independent, we need people to be challenging, we need people to be answering and asking new questions that are their own questions. And I think that that will function, maybe even better in a context like Africa than, in other more developed contexts. The second point, I think, picks up on what Professor Smith was saying. In Aberdeen, we're developing a new campus. Now, granted, it's in South Korea at the moment rather than in Africa, but I think what we're doing there really answers and addresses your question in a very specific way. The programs that we will be offering there are subsea and topside engineering directly in connection with the oil industry. The courses involve internships. They involve a significant amount of teaching that's done by practitioners, some of whom will come from Korea, some of whom will come from the United Kingdom, and it will involve direct engagement with industry, and the programs are shaped by industry, so that it's academic programs that are very specifically designed, very practitioner-oriented, and meant to be transformative. And I think that that's a model that we will be exploring in Africa and elsewhere, because I think that that's really the model that we need to be thinking about.
Dr. Okunida, let me bring you in from Lagos and throw the question to you, the relevance of foreign universities in the African context.
Well, I do think that they have a role to play. First of all, to comment on the points that have been made there, I think that, yes, I support the view that we have to educate students to be able to learn by themselves and to be able to be creative in thinking. I think that too often the system by which we deliver the education actually goes against that. The traditional system of learning by rote, which does not include so much of experiential learning and other such tasks that task the thinking and creative abilities of the students. So I do believe that I support the view that we have to see more of that. Now, if we look at the influx of foreign universities into the continent and into the sub-region, I think it's a good development for a number of reasons. The point has been made about the sufficiency of the number of universities on the continent for the huge population. So indeed, there is a lot of room, if you like, or capacity for additional universities to be brought in. I do see that, with the foreign universities, they come perhaps because they have a longer history, if you like, of university or higher education. So they bring that experience to bear, which could be beneficial. However, the challenge that sometimes I have seen or observed with a number of universities is actually how nuanced they are. I think that all education, whilst having a global perspective, it should be contextual. And in some instances, what may be relevant in a clime may not be relevant in Africa, because you have to take the peculiarities and the needs of the continent into consideration. So sometimes I see a disconnect between the models that are being taught in respective courses and what is applicable here, which is not to say that best practices shouldn't be taught there, but then how do you contextualize that to the environment? Another phenomenon which I think perhaps I've observed, which perhaps may not be ideal, is really the faculty that's available, that's brought in by the foreign universities. Most times, not most times, on occasion, you find that they have a fly-in, fly-out faculty. And I believe that consistent with what I've just mentioned about being contextual in the knowledge that is being delivered there, that comes from a knowledge of the environment, which most times cannot be adequately gained remotely. So with faculty that are on ground, in some instances they use a combination of local faculty as well as foreign faculty. In other instances, it's completely foreign faculty that fly in and fly out there, and may not be sufficiently grounded in the context of the environment in order to impart that to the students as well. But then, of course, we've mentioned other skills that are universally applicable, which the method of delivering the classes may impact to the students as well there. So overall, good development, but I do believe that perhaps the model can be tweaked to be more suitable to the needs of the continent.
Dr. Bizi, how is Carnegie Mellon making itself relevant to the Rwandan context?
I guess continuing on the preceding discussion, the role of a university like Carnegie Mellon here in Rwanda is quite unique. For those of you who don't know much about Carnegie Mellon, it is ranked in the top 25 best universities in the world. We are the only world-class university that is actually with a campus in Africa. So I'm a professor from Carnegie Mellon and I live here. This is my 5th year that I live here. And the reason for that is exactly to address what the preceding person was saying about I think it is very difficult for you to teach students in Africa unless you understand the African problems and the African environment. Because you may teach them things that may be valuable and may be applicable back in your country, in Silicon Valley or in Paris or Germany, but that are totally unapplicable here. And I see that every single day. So by us being here, faculty residing here, and integrating the problems we understand from the region into our courses that we teach, not only the courses, but the exercise the students have to do, the practicum they have to do, it makes it much more relevant for them so that when they graduate, they find a job immediately. 100% of our graduate students have found a job within less than 6 months from graduation. So I think that understanding of the environment is very important. Now, let's recognize that this is a very costly model. You know, it costs some money to bring people like me here, but this is a vision from this government. This government has made this investment for a period of 10 years, and the goal is that over 10 years we will transfer over the skills to our own students. We have students who finished their master's degree with us who are currently pursuing a PhD degree in the United States that will come back here and then replace people like me and my colleagues to continue teaching as they have learned the process by being into the process itself, graduating from a master's degree from Carnegie Mellon, which, believe me, is quite different than any other master's degree you could find in the region, and then, you know, getting that capability of a PhD degree so that they can come back and even start research like we do here, and then take over so that they don't need us anymore, so that they become self-sufficient, but they at least move this institution to a level that is close to world-class level and that can compete globally.
Dr. Beasy refers to the massive investment needed to establish on the ground in country. Again, I come back to the Lancaster, Ghana example. Perhaps you can give us a little more around establishing a university in a country given different regulatory environments and the level of investment that's needed.
Yeah, I mean, the level of investment is very significant, and that's why the model that we have in Ghana is a very kind of attractive one for Lancaster, because we obviously do it in collaboration with transnational education, and that's very important because we use the local expertise about infrastructure provision with the academic expertise of a university like Lancaster. And I think that's a key model, because if it was up to the university to require all the upfront investment, it would be very expensive indeed. And you can hear from the model we heard from Dr. Bizet that the Rwandan government is needing to invest a very significant amount of money up front to make it attractive for Carnegie Mellon to go there. So all of those activities are big investments. But the other key point, I think, has been mentioned now on 2 or 3 occasions, is, and I agree entirely, that you have to base some of your faculty on the ground there. And we've done exactly the same thing. But of course, it then adds to the expense of doing that. But without that, you don't contextualize it. To have either just faculty flying in or just do it with local staff, I don't think is the right answer.
This is under discussion at Aberdeen as well.
Yes, I mean, we have exactly the same issues in thinking about how to contextualize transnational education, how to make it meaningful for the society in which you're building it. And as I mentioned, in our campus in Korea, we're facing exactly the same questions, and the Korean government is very seriously saying to us, how many people will be based in Korea? And we're looking at that question because we want it to be relevant to that society. And clearly, if we're going to do a similar exercise in Africa, we have to do it in the same way, thinking about the African context, the needs of the African society, and as my colleagues have mentioned, most importantly, making sure that whatever we're doing, it's building capacity, it's giving back to the society. It's not something that a foreign university is coming in to make money. It's coming in to build capacity, to give to a society, and to bring high quality education that's shaped for the context into a new location.
Michelle Atkins, Internet Solutions, you have a question for us.
Yes, please. First, I'd just like to make a comment. I think all the panelists, as well as the audience, are in agreement that academia is important, education is important across the continent, but also across the world. Perhaps you can share with us a bit more practical type of insight. So the Dean of Henley kindly shared, where we don't really have time for long research that 10 years hence something is going to happen. There's a hunger from students, there's a hunger from parents, there's a hunger from government, there's a hunger in every country across the continent to get education right. Academia doesn't seem to be happy, industry doesn't seem to be happy. What are the practical things we can do now? Does there need to be a policy to say, industry must now commit 5% of their revenue to help educate? You know, what practically can be done now on the ground to improve education, to ensure that the skills that are required, not only the universal applicable skills that you all spoke about of innovation, creativity, independent thinking, but importantly that we're having the skills, as your colleague over in Nigeria said, to meet the economic needs of the country, to bring the continent, to bring it to its next level. So less academic theory and a bit more practical, perhaps, of what we can take away.
Michelle, thank you very much for keeping us in check. And I think, if I may, that will bring us to an appropriate point for concluding remarks, where we move to the solutions to satisfy the hunger that exists on the African continent for tertiary, for higher education. So I'm going to ask for concluding comments on that very pertinent issue and the reality check. Professor Smith, let's start with you.
You know, I'd very much welcome a 5% top slice tax on industry to fund higher education, and I'm sure that would go down like a lead balloon in the kind of industrial business community. However, the serious point you're making is a very relevant one. Is how do you make those practical steps? And I think that there are two kind of answers to that. The first is, if industry really wants particular skills, I think that tailored courses, there's no reason that they can't be co-developed models. And that's why I was pushing it, saying at the postgraduate level, particularly when you're taking a person who has had broad training in some academic discipline, but nevertheless the industry that wants to employ them says that now to tailor it to make our industry more effective in our industry. That model, I think, of co-development is something you can do, and there are great examples across the whole world of courses like that. But but it's pretty limited. It's not a systemic answer to the question. I think the second point is then understanding the policy environment which the government creates that incentivises, because most of us, not all of us, but most of us respond to incentives. And if those incentives are got right, particularly at the policy level, then universities are wonderful at gaming systems and actually turning situations to their advantage. But the policy context has to be correct, that makes the incentives appropriate for the right behaviours then to kind of come out. So the practical thing is for government to be clear what it needs the universities to solve, and then create a policy context which drives it, because they will respond. There's no doubt they will respond.
Dr. Okonido, let's bring you back in from Lagos. We have an impatient continent when it comes to education. I also have an impatient audience here in the studio in Johannesburg, South Africa. Have we left out an important element in our debate, and that is technology, and how technology can potentially fast-track the education space across the African continent?
Oh, certainly. I think that we've missed out that, and indeed I was going to refer to it in my concluding remarks. I think that we have to look at how we can leverage technology across the internet to deliver the education. And earlier on, one of our colleagues mentioned that or referred to the fact that it's really the emphasis on universities, while there's a large gap in the middle that also have to be educated in order to develop a skilled workforce. Now, I think that across the spectrum, we can start to look at increased use of technology to deliver education. I do not believe that it can completely replace the traditional classrooms there, but I do believe that there are a number of quick wins that we can make in this regard. So if we look at the continent, I think that what we require now is what is a scalable model, what is a low-cost model that's scalable. Yes, the investment in technology could be huge at the onset as well, but when we think about the ability that we can leverage on in order to reach people across remote areas of Africa in order to deliver the education, which will be cheaper for them, I think that that's extremely important. more and more, if we're going to bring the global perspective into our classes here in Africa, it's not always the case that we will be able to bring, world-class learning and faculty to come and deliver. This is where technology also comes in as well. I do believe that the ability to collaborate between local universities as well as foreign universities can also be enhanced by the use of technology there. So I believe that we still have to exploit this. We have a long way to go with some foray in this regard there. But at the national level, if governments are serious about actually doing something to impact the level and the quality of education there, a lot of thoughts has to go and action has to go into how technology may make this happen.
Dr. Beezy, is technology the silver bullet when it comes to the massification that is needed in the higher education space?
Technology can certainly be used to significantly, I think, improve the quality of education. As you know, most of the content is now digitized, and education is nothing else than transfer of knowledge, transfer of information. And now we can digitize not only text information, but also images, video, sound. And as you know, in the African culture, it's more difficult sometimes for African students to read. They can capture information much more easily with video kind of interaction, for example. So you could basically adapt the education to the skills of your students. But let me push us a little bit further. I believe that we have not seen anything yet in terms of technology-enabled transformation in higher education. Even the famous MOOCs, the massive online open courses, while very exciting idea, have had very little impact so far. The percentage of people who are completing those courses is usually below 10%. However, they provide a lot of good content that African university could use to deliver in their classroom in a blended format where some of the course would be delivered through technology and some with the professor, and using the flipped classroom model where students actually look at the course before they actually have time with the professor, and that time is then used for the best possibility of using the expertise of the professor in hands-on problem-solving problems, for example, and things like that. But the last movement that I believe we're going to see is, if you know about big data and what big data has been doing to digital marketing where today you can deliver to an individual exactly what he or she may be interested in based on this huge analysis that is done about data about that person. I believe the same type of technologies can ultimately be used in education, whereby as students interact with the system, you can capture a lot of information about them, and you can then customize the content delivery of the education to each individual student, addressing each individual weakness and problems that they have. And once we can do that, that will be fantastic, because one of the problems you have when you have massive classes like we have in Africa, it is impossible for a professor to address the problems of 200 students in front of him. But with the help of the technology, that can be done. And I believe that may have a significant impact in the future.
In other words, Professor Kuhnen, we haven't seen anything yet in terms of how technology is going to change the landscape, specifically in the African context.
I mean, I think that's absolutely true, and my colleagues have already said quite a lot about that. I think a key bit of it is going to be the transformation of what it means to be a university, and how students engage with a university. And it's going to totally transform. So students will come in different ways at different times through their university careers. And sometimes they'll come in through different types of blended learning where they're actively involved with other students in classrooms across the world. In other times, they'll engage with a much more traditional type of computer-aided, internet type of education with text and with video and with sound. In other times, as they'll go to one university, perhaps in the United Kingdom, perhaps in different parts of Africa, and choose different elements to construct a type of degree that will be totally different than the very structured types of degrees that we're thinking about now. And that's part of the individual tailoring of education that will be absolutely transformative. And it's a recognition that education is much more than about giving students information. It's about transforming their ways of thinking and their ways of being.
Well, that brings us to the end of our meeting of the minds discussion, the future of education in the African context. Thank you to Professor Mark E. Smith, Vice-Chancellor, Lancaster University, UK, Professor Seth Kunin, Vice Principal for Internationalization at the University of Aberdeen, Dr. Inasi Okonido, Dean of Lagos Business School, joining us in our Lagos studio, and Dr. Michel Bizi, Distinguished Service Professor, Engineering and Public Policy Associate Director, Carnegie Mellon University, joining us from Kigali, Rwanda.